Will you be remembered after you're dead? The Z-List Dead List podcast about obscure people from history with me, Izzy Lawrence. Hello and welcome to episode 2, series 10 of the Z-List Dead List. I got 2 out in a month. I'm a genius. I'm dead chuffed with myself. Making podcasts is difficult, but I do love them and I like the fact that you do too. If you want to listen to another podcast, I do one for the British Museum called the British Museum Membercast, and the latest episode of that is all about Egyptian art. Another one's about to come out, which is all about the Living with Gods exhibition in the British Museum with the curator Jill Cook, explaining the objects and a bit more of their history and stuff. And yeah, this episode of the Z-List Dead List I am dead chuffed with. Not as chuffed as I was when my bit for the Making History show on BBC Radio 4 goes out Tuesdays 3:30pm, guys. My latest bit got made Pick of the Week on Radio 4. That means it's like the best radio. The best on all the BBC that fits into a half-hour show once a week on a Sunday. Boom. Anyway, I'm very pleased about that. If you want to know more about that piece and jiu-jitsu suffragettes in particular, then you need to listen to an old episode of the Z-List Dead List. I think it's in series 2. It's called Of Mice and Policemen. All episodes are available on izzy.com. That is ISZI.com. Or on the Z-List Dead List website. It's got Naomi Paxton and Helen Arney in it. One talking about violence against policemen, the other one talking about gardening. Go Women's Lib. Anyway, this episode is not about Women's Lib, although it is quite progressive. It is exploring our modern ideas of progressiveness and reordering society, and also coins. You're going to hear curator and wonderful man Ben Alsop. I don't introduce him very well in the show, by the way. The live show at the British Museum has a habit of being run by curators, so I tend to now introduce the curators in the most negative way possible. Otherwise the audience votes for them and they win. But Ben was an absolute sweetie and really funny and really interesting, so I really hope that you like this episode, which is full of men called Thomas.
For those of you who came along to a Z-List Dead List show in July, you will know that we have 3 invited speakers and we have one who isn't kind of invited, but they're a curator at the museum, so they're kind of here. And so far, because I think all of the members are biased, the curators have won every single Z-List Dead List so far. So, for this, what I want you guys to do is basically don't listen to him. That's the only fair... So, yes, your final Z-List Dead List historian, and we'll put his name, it's Ben something, Alsop. There you go. He's going to come to the stage and he's going to, bore you with stuff, but you don't feel the need to laugh. That's very important. It's just about learning. It's very dry. You won't enjoy it. That's what I'm saying. Just lower your expectations because, curators... I'm not trying to bias the vote at all. Will you please welcome to the stage your final historian, Mr. Ben Alsop?
Hello. I mean, don't feel you have to vote for me to win, but in the curator's common room tomorrow, if I don't, I'm going to get absolutely lampooned by Irving Finkel, who sits in the corner shouting at people and swearing. I think if any of you came to the early ones, I think he swore a lot, I understand. But I won't. I'll be swearing once, probably. So the person I'm going to talk to you today is actually a remarkable man, and he's remarkable because he is a committed Democrat in a period when there were very few of them. He was born in 1750 in Newcastle, and the reason I wanted to speak to you about him today is because what he tried to do was completely change British society. Unrecognisably, he wanted to completely do away with the aristocracy. He wanted to completely do away with any sense of land ownership, and he wanted to create a much fairer society. Now, therefore, you have the perfect moment this evening to use your democratic vote to vote for him. And now, if you don't, I can only take it that you hate democracy. Which I appreciate makes no political sense, but we are living in times that has no political sense whatsoever. So it's absolutely perfect. This is quite confusing and strange for me, because I'm used to talking to coin clubs and, local... That's not funny. That's my life, okay? Do you want to see a man dissolve on stage?
So obviously you're, head of like Jingle Jangles.
I'm the curator of the City Money Gallery,
Yeah.
so I work in the Department
Head
of Coins and
Jingle
Medals.
Jangles.
No,
That's
I must say that is our keeper. Who's
Okay.
He's the keeper of Coins and Medals. The wonderful title.
But you're
Money
the,
Gallery curator.
Yeah,
There
you're
we go.
the Money Gallery curator.
City Money Gallery curator, yeah. The City Money Gallery, so that's the history of money. So it's
Yeah.
4,500 years, and mainly coins, just the nature that they're the things that have survived, but also banknotes and a myriad other stuff.
How
Really,
old's the oldest banknote?
the oldest banknote is probably the oldest banknote we have in the collection is probably about 700 years old.
Ooh.
From China, but there are older. We just don't know. But yeah, they date back over 1,000 years. Maximum.
Just IOUs.
Yeah, well, to some extent, and they're pretty mad actually. The one we've got is from the Ming Dynasty, from the 15th century, and on it says that if you try and counterfeit this, you'll be beheaded, and then if you give evidence against someone, and then we find them guilty, you will receive all their possessions and a cash reward. So it's like Crime Stoppers, but kind of
Written on a...
Imagine that on a banknote now. I mean, it'd just be.
Beheading would put me off forward, but I just... It's just so difficult. Like, all that time, and I spent intricately tracing
not bad
something,
for
you
it.
end up with a fiver.
Yeah. We've got a hand-drawn Swedish banknote from the 19th century where someone's hand-drawn it, and it's all smudged in places, and it's like, oh, that must have taken them so long to do. And you wonder, is it worth it? But they obviously felt it was. So it's a history of money, but also a history of the world through money. So that's what we're trying to do with it. Right?
And that yet you pick somebody who's very anti-capitalist, which is nice.
But money still has a role to play in a society.
this
You
is
know,
true.
he's not say. This idea of the beginning of communism where money would have no role. He is kind of like, he does see the point of it. But yeah, he is someone who just wants to fundamentally change the society. So I'm used to talking to, say, 10 or 15 people in a community centre with like a Zumba class going on above. And I did a talk last year in Worthing where a man turned up quarter of an hour late. I kind of nodded and smiled. I looked back at the screen to remind myself what I was talking about. When I looked at him, he was already asleep. In a crowd of 15 people, 2 were asleep. So if you feel kind of Morpheus grab you, just go for it. It really doesn't matter. You're welcome. But back to Thomas Spence and not my sad life. But this is a token that he produced, and it talks of his own political and his own societal changes that he wanted to do. He often talked about being as free as a cat. He wanted people to enjoy the freedom he had, and by following his doctrine, his political doctrine, you yourself could live free as a cat. I mean, he took the cat thing too far. He was arrested on 4 separate occasions for shitting in his neighbour's flower beds. That's my joke. It's so liberating not having to say the truth. Before I talked to you about him, I thought the best way to explain him to you was to maybe read a little bit of his writing. So this story takes place in Hexham. I like graphics, look at that. It involves a wood. And it involves some nuts. Now, Thomas Spence wrote in 1801 in his piece called Gathering Nuts. He spoke about a particular event that he had when he was gathering nuts in Hexham in a wood. I don't know why I repeated that. That's what that's for, in case anyone falls asleep and you wake up suddenly. And so what happens is he's walking in these woods and he's gathering nuts, and suddenly a woodman pops his head through a bush. Now, this is what Thomas Spence says happened. The woodman says, "What are you doing?" And Thomas Spence says, "Well, I'm gathering nuts." And the woodman, helpfully on a narrative arc, says, "Gathering nuts?" ? He says, "Well, of course I am. Would you ask a monkey or a squirrel why they gather nuts?" And the woodman thinks, "But you can't just take this. You're not on common land. This land is owned by the Duke of Portland." Now, this really gets Thomas Spence going, and he releases his barrels, social and political thing in this poor unsuspecting woodman who tells him, "You can't be here, this isn't your land." And he says this, "But said I, nature knows no more of him than me, the Duke of Portland. Is this an Englishman's birthright? Is it for this we are called upon to defend this wood and this country against the enemy? What must I say to the French if they come?" I don't know what the French are doing in a wood in Hexham. That would be my first question. Hey guys, if they jeeringly ask me what I am fighting for, must I tell them for my country, for my dear country in which I dare not pluck a nut? Would they not laugh at me? Yes, and do you not think I would bear it? No, certainly I would not. I would throw down my musket saying, "Let such as the Duke of Portland who claim the country fight for it." Now he finishes with a wonderful kind of riposte. So this is Thomas Spence talking about this meeting he had with this poor woodman. And he says, "This reasoning had such an effect on the forester that he told me to gather as many nuts as I please." Now, you can read that in 2 ways. You can, of course, say, of course, your language, your political viewpoint, it was convincing, it was well thought through. The other way to say it is, what more likely happened was Thomas Spence collecting nuts. Some poor guy just said, "What are you doing? You're not meant to be here." He then talks about squirrels, monkeys, the French. And when it says, I convinced him, he said, "Gather as many nuts," that's more like, "Take as many nuts as you want, mate." Seriously, I'm not paid for this. This is above my pay grade. And that's probably more likely. And this kind of gives you an insight into Thomas Spence, because I think the way to talk about him is he was so politically forceful. He believed his ideas, his political doctrine so much that he made him quite a difficult man to be around, apparently. What I thought I would do now is kind of talk to you a bit about his life. So he was born in 1750. He's one of 19 children. One of 19 children. Now you get kind of a Channel 4 documentary about you if you're one of 19. Then it probably didn't make any difference whatsoever. There was probably a family of 30 down the road and one of 50 down the other, and they lived in a shoe or something. And so he was in Newcastle, born in Newcastle, to a very poor family. His father was a rope maker and his mother was a seamstress. And now, the biggest gift that they gave him was that they taught him to read and write. So one of 19 in Newcastle, but they taught him to read and write. When reading about him, it says that his father taught him to read whilst his children were at the stall. So his father would be working on the stall, and his children would be with him, just reciting passages from the Bible.
Aww.
Which is, it's nice.
It's a bit boring, but...
And also it might deter people from going up there.
Well, it depends on the time. The Bible could have been really hip.
That's true.
That is.
And as long as they're not the tough bits from Leviticus, or, the really brimstony stuff that would scare people away, I suppose. But so he taught to read and write from his father. And then, importantly, one of the biggest things he wanted to do was actually make education accessible to all. So he came up with his own phonetic alphabet and created his own dictionary.
Now that sounds, like, when you described it, it sounds like the most complicated...
Well, that's probably because I described it incredibly badly. But what it essentially was he came up with the grand repository of the English language, which is his own dictionary, using his new method of spelling, which was a phonetic method. So,
I see a sense of problem with this already.
Yes.
Phonetic spelling, and he's a Geordie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there are still issues when you try and work out exactly what the sound he was making. Yeah. But at the heart of it was a very good idea, and that was the problem with the English language is in the 18th century there was no formal, obviously, state provision of education. So it made it very difficult for the working poor to actually learn to read and write because they just weren't given the opportunity. So he wanted to make the English language as easy as possible to learn. So he added 17 letters to the English language. And each letter, therefore, within his dictionary had a very own specific sound. So there was no duplicating of sounds which you get in the English written word.
And, yeah, and it's like pussycat.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like,
perfect example.
Exactly. It's not exactly the most easy. It's like beer here.
Yeah.
Spelt the exactly same sounds.
Completely counterintuitive. Yeah. And so he came up with a letter for every sound that he thought was within the English language. He then created his dictionary. The only problem was, and to show the success of it, he was the only person to ever use it. No one else published with it. No one else did it. He did publish some works in it, and he tried to push this idea. Now, when in his mid-20s, he focused on the two problems that he thought was most blighting this nation. So late 18th century, early 19th century, he saw the two biggest problems that were blighting the nation, one of education and one of politics. And when he's 25, he puts forward ideas to actually rectify this. 25. I wasn't doing that when I was 25. I just started work here. I was working really hard, getting my head down, but I wasn't thinking about ways in which you can change the world. I was thinking about coins. Now, the other big problem he saw was politics. And he saw that if you were wanting to be a politician or if you were wanting to change society, you had no access to it unless you were born into a political class or you were born with land. And this was the big problem. So his idea was of land reform. So in 1775, at the Newcastle Philosophical Society, for such a place existed, he put forward this idea of land reform. And this was that all land would be held in common by local parishes. People would pay rent. No one would own land. You'd still have your own personal possessions, but you'd pay rent. And then the money that you'd give would then be put back into society in the wake of free education, healthcare. If you couldn't work, you were given welfare due to disability or you're just unemployed. He believed in complete universal suffrage. He was a remarkable man. Thomas Spence, in the 1790s, leaves for London after being in Newcastle. He burns his bridges with the Newcastle Philosophical Society. They think his ideas are too radical. They think him too much of a troublemaker. They have trouble with him because he tries to sell versions of his talk that he gives in pamphlets. He gives them away. And they don't like this because they think they'd be bringing their company into disrepute. He also gets in scrap. So he was 5 foot tall and he was a very ill man. But he got in actual fights about his land reform. He got in a very famous fight with a man called Buick, who was an engraver, whose work we actually have some of it in the museum. And they got in such a fight that it ended in a quarterstaff fight between these two men arguing about land reform. And Buick mentions this, and he says this about the fight and about Spence. He became quite outrageous and behaved very unfairly. And you think, oh, well, that's terrible. And then Buick says, which obliged me to give him a severe beating. And interestingly, here we see Spence actually echoing down the ages, because if you go to any town or city centre in London, across the country on a Friday or Saturday night, the catalyst to the vast majority of fight is land reform. And if you go to... It still happens this day... and outside any Yates's, outside, these fights are happening, and it's all because of land reform, and it's all because of Thomas Spence and Thomas Buick having this fight. So he comes down to London in the 1790s. He leaves his first wife. His first wife, I don't know the name of, but let's, for argument's sake, call her Ruth. And therefore, if I do call her Ruth, I can divide Thomas Spence's life into two distinct parts. So you have his political time when he's with Ruth, so I call that the with Ruth politics. And then when he leaves her, it's post-Ruth politics. And that is... Yeah, thanks. And so that is where the phrase comes from that you all know and love, and I've just made that up. And so he comes down to London and he tries to agitate and he tries to get people on board with his land reform ideas. He's such a committed man. So as I said, he uses any means necessary. So he's a songwriter. He takes kind of popular ditties of the time and writes songs with some absolutely cracking titles. The like of which you will never have heard, and the like of which you could never sing. So the song titles of some of them were Burke's Address to the Swinish Multitude. That's a pop song, isn't it? Any pop... Swinish Multitude. Brilliant. And Burke was a historian who described people involved in the French Revolution as being part of the Swinish Multitude. So this was a dig at him. Another one I love is The Propagation of Spensonianism, written in Shrewsbury Jail in the year 1801. A real, toe tapper. And then finally, his absolute cracker, Address to Posterity, warning them against the landlord Judas. So these were songs that he wrote, and he wanted his followers to sing in public places. He used very informal ways to get this idea of land reform across. He also produced magazines. One of his magazines was called Pig's Meat, and it was kind of subtext was Pig's Meat or Lessons for the Swinish Multitude. Again, a fantastic name for a magazine. If you're in a W.H. Smith rack, you can, you've got Chat, some top shelf stuff that no one looks at, obviously, and then you've got Lessons to the Swinish Multitude. Now that is the name of a good magazine, I think. So he comes out with these ideas and he tries to sell these tracts, and he creates a publication called Pig's Meat, or Lessons for the Swinish Multitude,
which is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, in order to sell that, you have to go, well, I'm one of the Swinish Multitude. Swinish Multitude. Yeah. It's hard to say. Yeah. I'm one of the Swinish Multitude. Swinish Multitude.
I think it was to some extent, to kind of bring it to, I suppose, a contemporary comparison. It was the idea that when Hillary Clinton called the group the Deplorables, it actually became a badge of honour. Yeah. And the Swinish Multitude was something that a person called Burke described the French Revolution kind of main actors as the Swinish Multitude, the public with it rising up against the monarchy. They were known as. So it actually became something to be. You'd use it as we want to be part of that Swinish Multitude.
That.
Yeah, and I suppose that is that's we own this if we're going to be called it.
That's like hashtag Swinish Multitude.
There you go. Let's get that trending.
Pretty excellent.
And so he does all these kind of... And he gets arrested a bunch of times. Now, he did get arrested on 4 separate occasions. He spent over 2.5 years in one instance without ever being convicted. The first time he was arrested because the authorities thought he was selling Thomas Paine's Right of Man. However, Thomas Paine's is remembered much more fondly, I suppose, or certainly more well, if that's the phrase, which it isn't. He's remembered much more than Thomas Spence. Part of the problem is Thomas Spence himself issued a work called The Real Rights of Man. Now, that would be a problem, but the problem is he was arrested by the authorities firstly because they thought he was selling Thomas Paine's book. When it realised he was selling his own work, they let him go, which is surely the biggest kick in the teeth any social revolutionary can ever have. You're coming with us. He's like, yes, I've done it. Oh, it's not you. Oh, get out. And it's just, oh, come on. Because his claim is that he was using the phrase the rights of man 10 years before Thomas Paine.
Yeah, it's his first.
Yeah.
Thomas Paine nicked his idea.
That's what his suggestion is. I think he meets a guy, I may have got his first name wrong, but I think I've read something, his name was Thomas the Blaster. And Thomas the Blaster, as far as I'm aware, is like...
I think if your name's Tom, this is what you have to...
The Blaster.
Yeah, the Blaster is a...
I think it was Thomas, I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's something the Blaster. And he meets this guy, and he says that in 1781, so 10 years before Paine uses the rights of man, Thomas Spence writes above this guy's fireplace in chalk. He writes this poem that includes the phrase "the rights of man." So he's saying he uses.
So he gets away with it once, but he's damned if he's going to get away with it again, and eventually does get arrested for selling Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. So he spends a number of years in prison, and he's a real agitator. But all he's asking for is equality and fairness. That's his only kind of true aim.
With Spence, he was not backward in coming forward. He realised that there were many ways in which he should disseminate his message as well. So what he did, he produced his own tokens that were spreading his message about kind of his land ownership messages and his political doctrine and stuff. But also his followers stamped messages supporting him on coins, which would then go into circulation. Because
why don't we do that now? Because that is such a good meme.
Yeah, it does happen. Like, you do see it. People. There was a Greek artist who took euro notes and drew little pictures of people hanging themselves off buildings and kind of the Grim Reaper after Greece's problems with the euro. And you do get it. You can get stamps online, things that say like "I grew hemp," and then people stamp them next to George Washington because he was a big grower of hemp. And it's kind of that nefarious thing of saying, he's also supporting like the growth, cannabis and so on. But you do get it. People do use it because it's such a good circulating medium, and it just drifts between people.
I've never seen it. Occasionally get ones with like dentist drills with drilled holes.
Yeah, exactly. And
but that's not a sort of like protest.
No. And famously, listen to me. In the Money Gallery, we have the Suffragette penny, where someone has stamped votes for women across a coin, and then we think that would have obviously been a protest in about 1912, 1913.
Cool.
Yeah, and so there is a history of it. He would use many ways. He would obviously write pamphlets and sell tracts and versions of his speeches. His followers would graffiti walls.
This is sounding so much like Facebook. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, well,
exactly. It is like modern. So like he did Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn.
Well, it's that kind of thing. Yeah, different person for each one. His LinkedIn one was like a professional shot of him, kind of. Yeah, and he owned a bookshop near the museum actually. So where we are today in Holborn, he had a bookshop, the Hive of Liberty, I think it was called. And so he tried many different ways. He wrote songs because he realised that if he wanted to really appeal to everyone, he'd need as many different ways to do it as possible. So there are songs written by him about how landlords are corrupting the world and all these kind of things. They've got these wonderfully dramatic titles. They're not particularly they don't have a pop aesthetic as we would understand it, but they're really, they're really forthright. And so he used any way possible to disseminate this idea, and I think that is something that as a modern audience we can really kind of understand. And I think it's a pithy glib thing to say, but I'm sure he'd be like all over that kind of now, because it's just the best way to get your message out there. He'd have been the GIF king from
he'd have just done loads of GIFs and then sort of tweeted as well as done Facebook Live. Oh, Facebook Live is terrifying.
Have you ever been tempted?
No, I do it.
Oh, you do it? Okay.
Yeah. It's a case of every time I'm not wearing any makeup, that's the time I think, I'll be fine on Facebook Live. And then I look back at it and go, I look like I'm dead.
That's because they're like, any household lighting, it's like...
Yeah. Well, we should selfie this after the interview, that'll be...
Now, I thought I'd finish by just talking about one piece of work that he did in 1803 called The Constitution of Spensonia. Now, in this, he outlined his kind of utopian society. He outlined what he wanted society to look like under his guise when he was, when people followed his political doctrine. I mean, it's a very complete kind of look at the various facets and the way in which society will be treated and the way in which people within society will be treated. It's fascinating. I'd compel any of you to read it. I think it's really interesting. And it's, to a modern ear and to a modern eye, it's incredibly progressive. It's interesting that he calls it Spensonia, which is a bit arrogant, considering he's about the parish and the whole. I mean, he could have called it something far more like, Cuddle Land, or We're All Together in This Onia, or Disneyland, or something, I don't know. But he doesn't. He calls it Spensonia, and within this, he wants an equal society. So in it, he says that no land is owned, people pay rent, but what they get back in rent is you get free healthcare, free education. As I said, if you were disabled or unable to work, you would be looked after by the state. Men, women and children are all treated the same. He wrote very passionately about the rights of infants, which a lot of people laughed at the time. But he said, no, if we want to progress society, we have to look after all elements of society. And he also said that if you were fleeing a tyrant, you would be welcome into Spensonia. We would look after you. You can practice any religion you like, as long as as a parish you agree to practice that religion. And this is amazingly progressive. And these are things we ourselves haven't even reached. And he was suggesting these in the late 18th, early 19th century. And I want to finish with this idea of universal suffrage, because he was a big believer that everyone deserved the vote. But you can always get carried away with these people, and you can kind of look upon them and you kind of brush away their faults or the kind of elements of their doctrine that you probably don't agree with. And there is one bit here which you think, and I was reading it and I was going, oh, this is brilliant, this is so progressive, this is amazing, and then he kind of ruins it. Let me tell you, you'll see here. Female citizens have the same right of suffrage in their respective parishes as the men. They are in every respect, as well as on the account of their children, as deeply interested in every public transaction. So women have the vote, and this is 120 years before it even happens. And he's saying everyone should have a vote because everyone's got an invested interest. And the brilliant thing, his idea was you didn't have to be land to be an MP, you just had to be voted for by your local people. And you would be given a salary as an MP, so you didn't need an income or to be financially wealthy. You could be paid, and as long as you were voted for by your community, you could represent your parish. But then, as I said, women as the children on every account as deeply interested in every public transaction. And then he says this, but in consideration of the delicacy of their sex, and you're like, oh. But in consideration of the delicacy of their sex, they are exempted from and ineligible to all public employments. So, rubbish, isn't it?
That was his one thing. Women couldn't take an office job in a
not.
high office.
I mean, that would be
they could vote, but they weren't allowed to actually become a representative.
Obviously, our little heads, it was too much. Too much.
See, it's mad that idea genuinely persists into the 20th century, though. Like with all the suffrage movement, it's all about women they shouldn't sully themselves with that idea of being involved in politics because it's not fair on them, kind of thing. It's like, oh, Christ.
Well, it kind of, happens in the recent American election as well. There was quite a bit of, there's nothing that, whatever your feelings towards Hillary Clinton, there was nothing she could have said or done to be appealing.
Yeah, and you get that weird kind of, you've gone through the looking glass where women in America were being interviewed and they would say, I don't like the idea of a woman being in power.
Yeah.
25. He essentially thought that he had the answers to the major ills in the world, which was one was the access to language, learning, and also then land reform. He thought these and politics were the two biggest problems. So by the age of his early 20s, he kind of thought he'd sussed it, which I don't know what you were doing.
There is a sort of desperate need he seems to have to prove himself and do it quick.
Yeah, he's not, and that's what's interesting. He's an interesting fellow physically. He was 5 foot tall and he suffered a lot from illnesses. I think he had dropsy and myriad other illnesses.
So maybe he did think he was about to drop dead.
But maybe he just thought, I've got this time and I've just got to go with it.
If he was one of 19 kids in like the 1750s, 1760s, I can't imagine they all lived.
No, you fight for attention, and also you're living in a world where I suppose mortality is far more just an everyday thing to some extent. So by the time he was 25, his first public airing of his great thing, which was land reform, he kind of, mid-20s, he thought he'd sussed it, or at least had answers to problems, which is what I kind of love about him as well, because his answers, whilst we look back on them in hindsight, we think, well, that would never work, but he was so vehemently behind them that you kind of get won over when you read his stuff, because you think, well, and it's all positive, it's all saying people need more access to money, we need to be better for all strata of society. If you are fleeing, you can find refuge and find solace in Spensonia as well. They'll take people in from outside.
Refugees.
Yeah, he was like, if you're fleeing from another part and you want to join us and you agree with our politics, you're more than welcome to join, and all this kind of... and so he was very thorough in terms of, he wrote, and he thought it all out. The problem is, considering he's born in a city though, he does seem to be obsessed with this idea of land as in the countryside. So that's where he kind of based his idea about land being rented by people who work the land. But that doesn't really say much to the city, really.
No.
But he thought, he'd struck upon an idea that would mean equality, or at least an attempt to attain something equality where the working poor were not just abused and used for what they gave, and they were actually respected, and there was a sense of a cohesive society. Yeah. And I think that's just it's a very nice thought. Nice being worst choice of word ever, but it's a very enriching thought.
It is, and it would have been interesting to see what sort of place we would be living in now
if it was Spensonia.
Yeah. Well, if he'd got a big enough following and they had big enough sticks, we could have had a guillotine. Yeah. They're not. That could have been it.
There is one amazing thing he talks about where he says, for all this language of saying, we want to be accepting and, people should be looked after and all this. There is a part we said, and if you do sell your land to a private individual, you'll be looked on as if you'd essentially killed your own children. So he was very fire and brimstone in that sense. It was very, as long as you don't deviate from this path,
Otherwise, you will be just an absolute social outcast. So it's kind of accepting to a point, and then out comes the heavy-handed, high-minded rhetoric.
Yeah, this is the thing. It's a sort of like, yes, everybody would be absolutely happy if we all agree. Well, yeah, but...
Yeah, exactly. Thomas, I'm not sure about this. What is interesting, I think, why I like him, and what is that I don't have that character where it's just so steadfastly behind something that is, unblinking in their dedication to something. And I find it fascinating that other people do, and that talks to other kind of people that you must have talked about on this podcast, where it's just, they're so focused.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing character trait.
I think it's a sense of justice as well. I think in our society, who's that man? Adam Curtis talks about O'Dearism.
Yes, yeah.
And we've got that in spades. That sort of thing of going, well, we can try, but it's not going to make any difference at all because individuals can't make a difference.
Yeah.
And here's a man who just went, no, I can and I will. New alphabet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he's a fascinating man, and obviously he is someone that had, there is still a society, and there have been commemorations of him. And as I said, there are people far more versed in his whole kind of his writings than I am. But there are people still, working on him and writing about him because he's such a fascinating character.
It's just so nice to know that people in the past were just as crazy, but also much more driven than we were, which is ironic since they were before the motor car. Anyway, thank you very much for tuning in. If you're enjoying this, do get in touch. You can reach me at deadlist@hotmail.co.uk or through the Izzy, that's iszi.com website. The next episode of this should, and I say should because, wow, I'm busy, be out at the beginning of February, so the sort of second week in February sort of time. Listen out also for the member cast. That should be coming out in roughly a week's time. Thank you so much for everybody who is donating via PayPal. It does make a huge difference. It is a motivator. If you want to buy me the equivalent of a cup of coffee through PayPal, just use the donate button on izzy.com, that is iszi.com. Also, you can please review this on iTunes. Please share it with your friends. If you haven't already, like our Facebook page, Zlist Deadlist, and just like and share as much as possible. And I will produce more and betterer and get betterer guests, even though I think the guests I get already are pretty darn awesome. You've been listening to the Zlist Deadlist podcast with me, Izzy Lawrence. To find out more, please visit izzy.com, that is iszi.com. To support the show, share this episode with your friends. Already done this bit, haven't I? It's a big thank you to Ben Alsop. Keep tuning in, keep listening to podcasts. If you find excellent history facts, I am all ears. Get in touch via Twitter at ISZI_LAWRENCE, or on Facebook, or on Instagram, or anywhere. It'd be great to hear from you. See you in a couple of weeks.